For this last lesson, we're going to take a look at some of those key differences in greater detail between Hamilton and Jefferson and how the first political parties came. But we're especially going to look at how Washington dealt with such a party divide, how he actually was able to use that to an advantage that benefited the entire nation and all of our American history ever since. You have to understand, first of all, kind of what was going on. It really begins with Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton was somebody who had an incredible output. He was always producing documents, always producing statistics, always producing new ideas, and usually had research and papers to back up his ideas. One of these first papers was known as the Assumption Plan. And in the Assumption Plan, Hamilton simply proposed this. He said, look, all the states have different debts. Virginia has their own debt, Massachusetts has their own debt, New York, Delaware, they all have their own debts from the war. Why don't we, as the federal government, just assume all those debts? It'll just kind of be a good thing for us to do, and we'll just pay them down all together as a nation. After all, we're one country. Now, there's just one problem with this, or one thing that we have to kind of wrap our minds around, and that is whoever pays the fiddler calls the tune. In other words, if you're the one paying the bills, if you're the one paying down this debt, as it is in this case, then you're essentially the one who can call the shots because you're the one who has the power since you showed the cash to actually back up your words. Jefferson saw this as a threat. Furthermore, Alexander Hamilton released a famous report. It was called the Report on Manufacturing. And in this, he basically argued that the United States should have a central and single bank called the U.S. Bank. He also argued that the United States, as a federal government, should begin to control things in the economy, such as the rate of exchange, or put tariffs, which are basically taxes on imports. He thought this would protect our own businesses, and it does for a time, but what tariffs always do, as we'll study in later lessons, is they always make our goods, the things that we buy here at home, more expensive and of a lesser quality. And so Jefferson and Hamilton had this huge divide where they really butted heads. And the central question you need to kind of write down was we're basically asking the question of who has the power? Is it the states and the people, as Jefferson would have argued, or is it the federal government, as Hamilton would have argued? Of course, the Founding Fathers would have typically said it was all, particularly Washington, would have said that. But the second question they really had was, who do we ally ourselves with? Who do we really attach our future to? Is it France, as Jefferson argued with their revolution? Or is it Great Britain with all of their trade and all of their ideas of free market and even things like freedom of religion, which is what Hamilton argued? As a result of these divides and these questions, this is where you see the beginning of these two parties. First, we had the Federalists. The Federalists, you understand three things about them. First of all, they were for a central government. What that means is you have a very strong capital, and that capital has great power, great muscle that it can flex to kind of control all the other states. Secondly, the Federalists tended to be industrial. They believed the future of the world was all tied to manufacturing, to the factories themselves. And so they tended to put great stock in those kind of businesses, and particularly in amassing large amounts of gold. Third, the Federalists were pro-British. They believed that the United States should attach all of its interests to that country. On the other hand, the second party, the Democrat-Republicans, who we mentioned earlier, were the complete opposite. They believed the government should be decentralized, that federal government should have extremely limited powers, kind of like it did under the Articles of Confederation. They also tended to be agrarian, which means that they focus on the whole ideal of the farm. They believed that if a man was tied to the land and essentially earned his own living by his own sweat, then he essentially was a man who had more to fight for, and he would make a better citizen. As a result, they tended to be more pro-French. They believed that Britain, with all of its focus on trade and things of that nature, and especially a centralized, strong government based in the Parliament, was not the way to go, but that the government should be so limited that it would look maybe something more like what France was going through. What's kind of funny about that is the French Revolution actually produced great dictators, something that the Democrats and Republicans didn't understand from an early end. Even so, Washington, with incredible vision, with incredible headship, was able to lead these men well. And he, of course, was able to lead these men through his roles. First of all, as a visionary, Washington gave the men who had wildly diverse talents, he gave them goals of essentially fixing these huge problems that were beyond the powers or the capabilities of any one of them. So he gave them a problem that was bigger than themselves, which meant they were forced to actually work with each other. As a steady operator, Washington was able to communicate to each man how badly he needed them. He was able to communicate to each man that he listened to them and that he actually believed that they were right on several key issues. In fact, often the members of his cabinet believed that Washington was on their side and not on the other guys. The truth was, he was essentially on all of their sides. The vision he had for the country essentially incorporated both the vision of the Federalists and the vision of the Democrat-Republicans. It's just that Washington wasn't going to go all the way of Hamilton or all the way of Jefferson. And finally, as a commander, Washington knew how to delegate. He knew how to pass on responsibilities. In fact, he was known for giving the men so much work they didn't even have time to bicker and argue. It was a brilliant strategy to get the very best out of them, and Washington was a brilliant encourager, always at the back behind these men, which accomplished such great results during both of his terms as president. Now, after he served his 2 terms, Washington gave his great farewell address, a very famous speech, and then he returned home. Always the backstory of Washington, always where he comes back to. It's kind of like The Hobbit, or there and back again. In fact, when he returned home, let me read to you a typical day in his life at his latter years. Washington's own day was regular in the extreme, says the historian Paul Johnson. He would rise at 5 a.m., read or write until 7, breakfast of tea and corn muffins spread with butter and honey, then by horse to the endless inspection of fields. He would return at 2, dress, dinner. If there were guests, he chatted to them afterward over a glass of Madeira. Then he read the newspapers, getting 10 in all, and writing letters. He would have tea at 7, then talk till 9, and then bed. When Washington died on December 14th of 1799, the country lost an incredible figure, but they really lost someone who was a visionary, a steady operator, and a commander all rolled into one. It was that federal headship that makes Washington worth a careful study to us in the 21st century.